Hopefully. Okay, I just hit record. Okay, cool. Thank you, Miranda. Sorry for that. Okay, so I'm looking through the chat right now just to kind of see what everybody is mentioning about their use of keto. So a lot of you have said, I've never tried it, never, never, never. I have measured ketones in the past, tried for a few weeks. Yes, I did a long time ago. I did measure. I'm doing the Verta program. I tried it for a few days, hard to give up the carbs. I didn't monitor ketones. This is great. I'm actually really, really happy that there is a lot of variation in the familiarity with this. I think that this is really going to be applicable to everyone. And and really when we're thinking about the ketogenic diet, I know we just asked like how many of you have attempted it before, but let me just put out the disclaimer that, today's presentation, we have a lot of people that have various familiarity with the ketogenic diet. So today's presentation is going to be of a general nature. There are a lot of studies that have been put out about people being in nutritional ketosis, the ketogenic diet. We're not going over the results of every single one. I've tried to do a good summation of some of the things that are out there that I think would be important for someone who's considering this to know. I am going to put some additional things to consider when you are doing your own research, and some of the other therapeutic uses for the ketogenic diet. And I also will put out the disclaimer as well that this is not typically a therapeutic diet that I utilize with my clients. And that's more so because my clientele are typically those with a significant history of disordered eating and eating disorders. So that does not always work well with those wanting to pursue a diet style of this nature. But really, I think that one thing that we can consider with the ketogenic diet, along with any other type of therapeutic diet there, is that this is just going to be another tool in the toolbox. This is something for us to decide, is this a tool that I need to use? Is this a good fit for me? What does this look like? But also just with any eating style, make sure that you are having those conversations with your physician anytime you're altering your diet significantly. And I would say with the ketogenic diet, this is going to be a pretty significant arrangement to how you're eating, for lack of better words. So I think really making sure that you are letting your physician know about that. Hopefully they would be working in tandem with a dietitian, as a dietitian would be working with you at the end. I'll let you know what you can expect partnering with a registered dietitian should you pursue a ketogenic lifestyle. So just to kind of give a quick little brief history of the ketogenic diet, some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not be, but really historically, people have associated the use of a ketogenic diet for medical reasons with the treatment of epilepsy. It's been found that using this therapeutic diet has a reduction in seizure behavior. And so you can see there was a first scientific publication in France in 1911. When we start looking at what's been available in the US, it was really in the 20s that we noticed with some of the starvation studies that there was a correlation with that starvation state reducing seizure activity. And it was also noticed through the research that these same results could be produced by introducing an extremely low carbohydrate diet to induce ketosis. And the popularity of these types of diets in relation to epilepsy kind of reduced whenever phenytoin, your other anticonvulsants were created. And then in the 90s, it kind of started to have a resurgence. So when we start thinking about what the ketogenic diet is, for many of us who are just casually hearing about it, we might think, oh, this is just Atkins 2.0, or, this is similar to paleo or any other type of low carbohydrate diet. And I think it's important for us to see some of the key differences that make it not the case as Atkins or paleo or any other quote unquote low carb diet out there. So our biggest keys to keto, we do have significant carbohydrate restriction. And by doing this and having most of our diet come from fat, what we're trying to do is get the body to be in a state where it is burning fat for fuel. So liver is going to break down our fat into ketone bodies, and those ketone bodies are sent back up to be used as an energy source for the rest of our body. And the thing about comparing the ketogenic diet to, say, something like Atkins. So when we're thinking about Atkins, we know that we go low carb, but usually with Atkins, there is an emphasis on being high protein and moderate to low in fat. And that's not the case with the ketogenic diet. You can see I kind of put in these boxes down below what that approximate percentage is of calories from each respective macronutrient with the ketogenic diet. So we're going to be very intentional with a majority of our intake coming from dietary fat. We're going to be very, very low in carbohydrate, and then we're going to have moderate protein. And the thing about the protein is it's a little bit of a kind of a measuring game, kind of really finding what works best. And the reason we have to be intentional with that protein is we want it to be adequate enough to make sure that we don't have significant muscle breakdown, but also too, we don't want to be too high in protein because our body is so resilient and brilliant and magical and wonderful. You'll see here that protein is kept high enough to maintain lean body mass, but it's low enough to preserve ketosis. For those that are biology backgrounds, any type of nutritional biochemistry, you may be aware that the amino acids, alanine and glutamine in protein can be converted to glucose through gluconeogenesis. So it nudges the body out of ketosis. So that's why it's really important to make sure that we truly have a high fat diet. So if we're looking at the percentages, approximately 70–80% of our daily calories coming from fat, about 5%-ish or less of our daily calories coming from carbohydrate. And then that moderate protein is going to be anywhere between about 15–20% of our calories. And I wanted to give an example scenario of what that looks like. So you'll see at the bottom, I put, if someone was eating around 2,000 calories a day, this would be about 1,500 calories exclusively from fat, 100 calories from carbohydrate, and then 400 calories from protein. And you can see I have the gram amounts here. So 166 grams of fat, 25 grams of carbohydrates, 100 grams of protein. Just putting that in perspective a little bit, and I'll continue to do this in our additional slides. But when I look at something like the 25 grams of carbohydrate, when I am doing what I would call a standard diabetic diet for one of my clients that's going to be fairly conservative in protein, normally I'm recommending anywhere between 30–45 grams of carbohydrate per meal, and then 15–30 grams of carbohydrate per snack. So you can see how certainly this is going to be significantly different from that in terms of thinking how low is low when we're taking a look at a ketogenic diet. And certainly in our discussion today, we're going to be looking at how to really do this in a quality way, because sometimes when we think about the ketogenic diet, we see the different memes there. And I've stuck a few of my favorites in here, but we think, oh, the bacon and butter diet, amazing, sign me up. And so, there's so much more to that. When we look at this from a clinical perspective, yes, a ketogenic diet is going to be very effective in a lot of things that people are trying to achieve when it comes to their type 2 diabetes and blood sugar management, cardiovascular disease and their lipid panel, definitely with weight loss. But, when we think about this from a clinical perspective, where we can really control what someone's eating versus real life eating, that's where we've got to take a good magnifying glass to see, does this work for me? So just to give another perspective, with a standard American diet versus the typical ketogenic diet, typically in our everyday diet, about half of our diet is composed of carbohydrate. I think that that there's nothing bad about that at all. I think food culture in general, a lot of times the carbohydrate choices that we often have are those that are from processed foods, fast food, things of that nature. But carbohydrates as a whole, great for the body. The body's preferred fuel source. They are built chemically to be digested pretty efficiently so that our body can pull that glucose slash sugar slash energy from that carbohydrate to energize whatever activity we're immediately about to do, whether that's fuel our brain to type up a report or go for a run. So when we start thinking about going into ketosis and forcing our body into going into fat burning mode from dietary fat and fat stores, those percentages of course shift for us. So when we think about how does ketosis work, again, I really like to kind of show some visuals for what this looks like. So when we think about a traditional diet that's going to be much higher in carbohydrate, we mostly eat those carbohydrate. Our pancreas is going to be secreting insulin. That insulin shuttles the glucose from those carbohydrates into the cells, and glucose is used for energy. When we're thinking about the ketogenic diet and really focusing on dietary fat, we're mostly eating fat. Lipase breaks down stored fat. Fatty acids travel to the liver. Liver converts that to ketones so that our body can use that. And ketones, so our brain can't use fatty acids for energy, but ketones can cross that blood-brain barrier, and that's where they can be utilized for our brain, which is normally very glucose hungry. But it's like, oh, use these ketones. I guess this is a pretty decent substitute. So it's like, okay, I can use this if you're not going to give me carbohydrate. And then also too, there can sometimes be this concern as we're casually learning about the ketogenic diet, being nervous about, oh my gosh, is ketosis safe? What about my friend who is a type 1 diabetic and she's gone into ketoacidosis before? What is that? What does that look like? Could that happen to me while I'm following a ketogenic diet? It is very unlikely for most folks. So we also want to acknowledge that they're not the same. So with ketosis, overall, there's going to be a pretty low level of ketones in the blood. Ketones are definitely produced. They're going to be in the blood, but they're not going to be in this dangerously high amount that you would typically see for ketoacidosis. Ketosis is a normal process of the body. It's a safe function of a low-carb ketogenic diet. And then you can see here with ketoacidosis, it's an extremely high level of ketones in the blood. It's changing up that blood pH. Normally with nutritional ketosis, that's not going to happen. We're not going to see a pH shift per se, or at least not one that is dangerously significant. It can turn the blood acidic, occurs in diabetics who don't take enough insulin or aren't well, people who are starving or alcoholics. So when we start talking about the ketogenic diet and those special considerations for those who may want to be a little bit more cautious about exploring it, I'll talk more about some of those specific populations. So, I'll hear people say, oh, I'm on keto, or I'm doing the ketogenic diet, but are you really doing keto? And I mean, I guess in some ways, truthfully, we can say yes. And I think when we think about that standard ketogenic diet, when we're thinking about those exact percentages, there's not necessarily a gold standard that's out there. I think there's probably some different indicators that are used with different organizations when they're trying to encourage their patients to follow a ketogenic diet. They'll create their own set of guidelines, but there have been a lot of various adaptations to this diet because of the popularity of the ketogenic diet and a lot of modifications that have been there. So sometimes you'll see in the literature people implementing it in a cyclical way. So they're doing 5 days keto, then 2 higher carb days. So, almost kind of similar to intermittent fasting where you do those cyclical days. Also, doing targeted keto, and this would be doing a standard ketogenic diet with those percentages that I showed you on the front end of things, but the carbohydrates are surrounding workouts. So within that very small amount of carbohydrates that are allowed, that 5% or less, we're going to save those carbohydrates for pre or post workout snacks, just so we can be strategic with that. There's also a high protein keto where it's 60% fat, 35% protein, 5% carbohydrate, and then your fad diet, your Atkins, modified Atkins, paleo, etc. So when you hear somebody saying, I'm doing a keto diet, are they really? What does that look like? And again, if they are seeing positive results from that, then whatever, who cares? They're seeing the fruits of their labor for what's working with them and their lifestyle. For the targeted keto diet and then the high protein keto, definitely created for those that are more active individuals. There is a lot of controversy about the ketogenic diet and those that are significantly active. There's a lot of back and forth research with that, with what the data is suggesting, and then also just anecdotal experiences from people where they'll say like, oh, it's no big deal for me, I still feel great. And then others say, oh, my performance levels have been significantly reduced, I'm a long distance runner, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're thinking about the pros of the ketogenic diet, we see in the data, in the research that's out there so far, typically the reports will indicate an increase in blood sugar control. We see weight loss. We see an improved blood profile, reduced blood pressure, increased HDL, which is that good cholesterol. And also just noting that it's effective with proper adherence is one of the big things that we want to take into consideration with all of this. And also to more flavorful and satiety inducing than other types of weight loss diets. And increased leptin and insulin sensitivity. And, for those of you who have utilized a ketogenic diet and even measured your ketones and felt like you were really, truly kind of putting in the effort of doing it as standard as possible, I'd actually love to know in the chat if you did find it to be pretty satisfying for you in terms of satiety levels and not feeling hungry. So any interaction that you want to share in the chat with your own experiences as we go through the presentation, I know that those that are considering and exploring this would probably love to hear that. Okay, let's also talk about the cons of the ketogenic diet. Extremely restrictive, especially when we start thinking about the fact that you're really not getting to eat any carbs at all. Various social consequences and social isolation. So, the big thing with this and trying to figure out if this is a good fit for you, number one, we want to prioritize, is this medically safe for me? But then also, does this fit in with my lifestyle? If I follow a ketogenic diet and truly follow it, what kind of things am I going to run into socially? Am I going to be able to join impromptu eating situations with friends? If I typically eat with my family, am I putting myself in a position to have to explain to my children or others that I'm eating with why they can eat carbohydrates, but I cannot, and possibly send some mixed messages with younger individuals in our family, or maybe we are in a living situation where we eat most of our meals independently, have control over what we eat, so that's not a factor. Also, too, really with the research, for the most part, it's been pretty short-term in nature. There's a handful of long-term studies, but really, we're looking at this from a short-term point of view as a therapeutic diet. Some potential side effects such as disordered eating, and then starting to have false food beliefs. So, I think for someone who decides to utilize this and then they want to go back to quote unquote normal eating, having this fear of reincorporating carbohydrates, what does that look like? Being really scared to eat anything that has any documentation of carbohydrate in the food label. So those are some things we want to consider. And then also medical complications such as refeeding syndrome. There's GI issues such as constipation and diarrhea, fatigue, possible nutrient deficiencies. When we start thinking about side effects of the ketogenic diet, this is kind of a good segue there, as well as talking about the keto flu. So when we think about the side effects of the ketogenic diet, when we're in that adaptation period, that first week or so, we are going to experience headache, decreased cognitive function, bad breath, fatigue, weakness, constipation or diarrhea, dehydration, vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and in the long term, bad breath, micronutrient deficiencies, loss of lean body mass. But when we're thinking about that adaptation period and those side effects there, many people lovingly like to call it the keto flu. And so I put this infographic here to kind of give you a better idea of what that looks like. And typically, this is going to be happening within that first week or so. And the reason that this happens is that as we're implementing this ketogenic diet and we have a significant reduction in our carbohydrate intake and we're increasing that fat intake, we have reduced insulin levels. And when that happens, we're losing a lot of our electrolytes. We're losing sodium, we're losing potassium, we're losing a lot of fluid, excuse me. And so because of all of those significant changes happening, it makes our body feel like crap. We end up having brain fog, nausea and diarrhea. We have muscle cramps, dizziness, irritability, constipation and body aches. And, really when we think about the constipation, that's going to be compounded by the fact that yes, we have reduced fluids in our system, but also too, a lot of our dietary fiber is going to be coming from carbohydrate sources. So, that decreased fiber intake is coming into play, especially soluble fiber. You're still going to be getting insoluble fiber from those non-starchy veggies, but that soluble fiber is going to be key to a healthy gut and just, keeping some motion in the ocean when it comes to those bowel movements. So that's something that we want to consider. And one of the ways that we can combat this and maybe make that keto flu time period a little bit shorter is taking supplements like a medium chain triglyceride or exogenous ketones. It really kind of helps reduce the time to reach nutritional ketosis. And when I mention nutritional ketosis, that's really just talking about that phase where our body has converted to using fat for fuel, and maintaining that and the production of ketones and really just kind of being in that state. But, when we think about how to help combat the keto flu from just a quote unquote natural perspective and not necessarily using supplements like the exogenous ketones, really pushing the hydration during this period of time, really increasing that water intake, also increasing our electrolytes, so our sodium and potassium, so that we can help restore that which has been pushed out of the cells. There's a lot of fluid that's being pushed out of those muscle tissues. If you think about your muscle tissues and your lean body mass like a sponge, when all of this is happening, so much of that fluid is being pulled out and those electrolytes are coming off at the same time. And we want to re-implement a lot of fluid back into those tissues. So we want to actively stay hydrated during this point in time. I see some folks in the chat kind of talking about their own experiences with the keto flu. Drinking electrolytes really helped. Ordering the keto meals online, being consistent, it works. I appreciate the fact that people are sharing their experiences, and please continue to do so throughout the chat, and I'll try to make sure that I take peeks at it as we go through everything. Okay. So also too, when we look at the ketogenic diet versus your typical weight loss diets, when we look at some of the key issues in terms of fat loss, lean tissue, anaerobic performance, aerobic performance, and strength performance, really when we're looking at just physical activity overall, in the short term, with fat loss, same really as any other calorie match diet. In the long term, same as any other calorie match diet. And that's not necessarily, a bad thing at all. This is just really kind of letting you know what that looks like. But with lean tissue, you are going to experience some lean tissue breakdown, some lean tissue loss that's going to be happening with a ketogenic diet. That's not to say that it's going to be so significant that it is unhealthy. This is just letting folks know, hey, this is going to happen. You might have a loss in lean body tissue. And if you know that this is a side effect of following a ketogenic diet, that means you can be really intentional with your protein intake, maybe even thinking for yourself, well, for me, I work out all the time. Keeping my lean body mass is important to me. Maybe I do my own modified version of the keto diet, and mine is a little bit higher in protein so that I can prevent as much of that breakdown as possible. Because really, as we start going into nutritional ketosis, people are like, well, how do I prevent this from happening? Our body has a lot of natural systems in place. It is very resilient. It's very protective. And so once it gets wind of the fact of like, oh my Lord, Nancy is not eating carbohydrates anymore. What in the world? I need some glucose in these cells. Your body kind of scrambles. It starts going into the playbook, looking and thinking, okay, what else can I break down immediately to fuel these cells? The next thing that our body wants to tap into, just as a natural response mechanism, is breaking down some of the protein in our lean body mass to be able to create some glucose, that gluconeogenesis track that I was telling you about. It's going to attempt that. And then once it realizes, oh, wait, but this person is also feeding me a lot of dietary fat, let me get creative once more and create these fatty acids, send them to the liver, and create some ketones. It starts to go into the other side of the playbook and taking a look at that. But it's first going to have that automatic response to want to break down some of that lean tissue. But we can prevent the amount that's broken down by making sure that we're intentional with our dietary protein intake. When we're looking at exercise performance overall, you can see just in the short term that oftentimes we're going to have a little bit of a decrease in our performance, specifically with our aerobic performance when it comes to exercise, being on a ketogenic diet. So when we think about what can make the ketogenic diet so attractive, I'll talk a little bit about satiety, that satisfaction factor that is happening when we're eating. And so what I hear anecdotally from those that I have interacted with as a clinician when it comes to the ketogenic diet is really the fact that it's like, hey, I'm not going hungry on this. Am I having some cravings for some carbohydrates? Sure. Am I wishing that I could have pizza at the office party? Sure. But in terms of actual sensations of hunger, I'm not necessarily feeling that. And so when we think about the power of the satiety here, protein and fat are the main players in all of this, because again, when it comes to carbohydrates, carbs are built chemically to be digested pretty quickly so that it can energize whatever activity we're about to do. Carbohydrates were not built to keep us full for a very long amount of time. So that's why I think anyone who is relying on primarily carbohydrates at a meal or snack traditionally may find themselves getting hungry sooner than later if they're relying just on carbohydrates at that particular meal. Same reason why sometimes we have to eat very large amounts of a refined carbohydrate before we get any sense of fullness. So like continuously eating the Cheez-Its or whatever, because just chemically, it doesn't have the power to give us that satiety that we need. But protein and fat take longer for the body to digest. So it's going to keep us full and satisfied for a longer amount of time. Protein is going to give that fullness. But then when it comes to that satiety factor, fat is really going to come in there, because fat is a pretty complicated molecule. It's a pretty complicated macronutrient. It takes a bit more work for our GI system to be able to digest that. And so there is some pretty significant satisfaction, satiety that's happening from fat overall. When we think about, fiber content, yes, fiber is going to, a carbohydrate that has fiber in it is going to have a little bit of a longer satiety than just carbohydrate on its own, but not that much. Really fat is going to kind of be the endurance player in all of this. So when we start looking at the research therapeutically, what the ketogenic diet has been used for, the strong evidence out there is utilizing it for epilepsy. There's been a lot of significant research now with the management of type 2 diabetes, and then also with cardiovascular disease. When we think about the emerging evidence, you'll now see in the data in the literature, things on the internet, information about the ketogenic diet with acne, cancer, PCOS, and neurological disorders. I've seen a lot lately as it relates to cancer and PCOS. As I was getting ready for this presentation today, definitely a lot of articles came up about the therapeutic use of the ketogenic diet with cancer, and I would implore you to definitely do some searching on your own in case this could be of help to you. Sharing with a colleague or anyone else that may find that helpful. I thought that was particularly interesting. I think with the emerging research for PCOS, a lot of that kind of correlates with the same mechanism of action of how they're seeing the benefits of a ketogenic diet for those with type 2 diabetes as it relates to insulin secretion, insulin sensitivity, et cetera. So with the research that's out there with type 2 diabetes and the use of the ketogenic diet, especially if people are using this primarily for the weight management perspective, and then also happen to have a diabetes, specifically, the research has found the benefits for those with type 2 diabetes, not type 1, just because of the nature of type 1 diabetes and the reliance on external insulin. So just keeping that in mind. But what the research has indicated, I kind of thumbed through a few different studies and read some different summations, but what you'll find typically in the literature is some significant decreases in hemoglobin A1C, which is the lab that is going to be revealing somebody's long-term blood sugar control, as opposed to just looking at fasting glucose. That A1C is really going to tell on someone in terms of how well their blood sugar has been controlled over about a 3-month period or so. Decreases in overall blood glucose, triglycerides, LDL, and body weight, increase in HDL, that good cholesterol. But still, there still is a benefit for having a calorie deficit while you're doing this. So it's not just, hey, I'm going to follow a ketogenic diet and not worry about calories at all. You still want to be somewhat intentional with your calorie intake, but your macro distribution is going to be from a ketogenic standpoint. But I think one of the things that can be a little bit frustrating with this, when you're looking at the different articles out there about the effectiveness of a ketogenic diet for someone with type 2 diabetes and is interested in intentional weight loss, is that there's not a lot of consistency in terms of the grams of carbohydrates that were utilized with the test subjects. So that optimal macro range is really still undetermined. And really, how was the ketosis confirmed in the subjects? How are they testing this? In some studies, it might be doing the urine with the strips, some were doing the blood, some were doing the breathing machines, testing for the acetone. So there's a lot of inconsistencies there. And typically too, this is going to be looking at those with type 2 diabetes who are using oral medications and are not necessarily at a stage yet where they are utilizing external insulin. So just wanting to keep that in mind. When we're looking at using this and cardiovascular disease in particular, the results of a randomized control trial with 120 individuals who were overweight, hyperlipidemic volunteers over a 24-week period. So that for the test group, they were eating less than 20 grams of carbs. Pretty low, like very, very low. They had supplements, exercise, and group meetings. The control group, it was less than 30 grams of fat, less than 300 milligrams of cholesterol, about a 500 to 1,000 calorie deficit. But then they also incorporated exercise and group meetings. And so when we look at that, test group that was following a ketogenic protocol versus just their normal low fat group, we had a 12.9% weight loss in the keto group versus 6.7% in the low fat group. When we think about the pounds of fat mass loss, we're looking at 20.5 pounds versus 10.5 pounds from keto group to low fat group. When we think about lean body mass loss, it is higher in the keto group. So that a little over 7 pounds versus a little over 5 pounds in the low fat group. And then when we're looking at some of the changes that are happening in that lipid panel, you can see at the bottom here, as far as serum triglycerides go, there was a more significant drop in triglycerides for those in the keto group versus low fat group. The HDL actually increased with the keto group, what we want to happen because that's that good cholesterol. And then we had a decrease with the low fat group in HDL actually. And then with the LDL, your quote unquote bad cholesterol, there was a slight increase, but again, you can kind of see not extremely significant there, but they did note that there was that increase compared to the decrease in the low fat group. So that's good for us to take into consideration. So when you start looking at these studies on your own, whether you're looking at the correlation of the ketogenic diet therapeutically for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, a lot of the emerging research with cancer and PCOS, you want to take a look and see how was keto defined, what amount of carbohydrate did they indicate induced ketosis, how was the ketosis verified? So really right now, there's no standard protocol or guidelines for the ketogenic diet, and there's independent groups that are kind of creating what that looks like. So each study kind of uses their own definition of the ketogenic diet, so that can make that assessment challenging. So again, when you're thinking, could this work for me? What is the research saying? I'm a very intellectual person. I want to take a look at what the research is saying. You might have some frustrations because there's some inconsistencies there. But again, if you find yourself benefiting from the diet and not necessarily following the standard protocol, and it's something that you can implement long term and feel sustainable, then that's great. So testing for ketones, I know many of you had mentioned in the chat that when you've done the ketogenic diet, you've done it. You've tested for your ketones. You've measured them, to actually say like, hey, I'm in ketosis. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like, some of the pros and cons and considerations for the different types of ways to check your ketones. And again, for those of you in the chat that want to share what your experience has been with how you confirm ketosis for yourself and measuring ketones, feel free to share that with the others in the group too. So first, we're going to talk about the urine strips. So this is measuring unused ketones, and typically the ketone that we're going to see in your urine, you'll hear it called ACAC or acetoacetate, and this is kind of one of the first ketones that's created, and you'll kind of use it. Or you'll see it kind of spilled over into the urine. And really, when we think about the pros and cons of this, the pro is that it's cheap and easy to administer, but the con is that it's not necessarily reliable in the long term. This is good in the beginning. And really, when we start to see ketones in our urine, that can be misleading because honestly, anyone who's kind of been in a reduced intake state in the beginning who hasn't eaten much or has starved, there's going to be some ketones that are produced. So it's not necessarily saying like, oh, you're finally in active nutritional ketosis. You're kind of jumping the gun if you use that. It's a good indicator to let you know, okay, my body's being deprived of something, so I'm headed there. But you don't want that to be the main way that you're measuring your you staying in ketosis during your process of implementing this diet. So that's just something that that you want to consider. So I know there's some folks in the chat talking about measuring their blood, which is a great way for me to kind of transition to the next way that we would check this, which is going to be through blood tests. And so usually with the blood meters that are out there, it is checking for BHB, which is beta hydroxybutyrate. And this is really a transport ketone. This is what you're going to find most significantly in your blood. And the pros of this is that it's the most accurate measure and it's best for long-term adaptation. And the cons are that it's a bit more expensive and invasive. So if you're like, oh, I don't know about all this, I don't know if I want to, finger prick all the time, that's just something to consider. But this is really going to be your gold standard for what's going to be the best way to confirm that you're in ketosis, especially when you're actively in that nutritional ketosis. Whereas with those strips, that's kind of just letting you know that you're headed in the right direction, but is not necessarily going to be your best bet as you're kind of long-term going into this. And that's why we recommend the blood test. And then we also have, we also have the breath test. I don't know how many of you have utilized the breath test, but this is going to be measuring the acetone in your breath. This is going to be an indirect measure, but it does correlate with the BHB, and it's measured in parts per million. And so what's nice about this is it's a reusable device. It's non-invasive. The only cons, though, are that it's an indirect measure and it takes longer to get a reading versus the blood and urine. And again, for any of you who use the breath test, let me know. Primarily, I've only been familiar with colleagues who have done the blood test and then those who have initially used the strips, but I've not necessarily worked with anyone consistently where they have used the breath test for those. So when we start thinking about those who should be cautioned against a ketogenic diet, probably need to do a little bit more research, maybe try to think of another tool in the toolbox to use instead. That is going to be an individual who has type 1 diabetes, because it's not going to be safe for that. We don't want to risk doing this and then getting into ketoacidosis, making this a very dangerous situation. Just the nature of how insulin is not created in the pancreas with type 1 diabetes, that's going to be problematic. And then also those with type 2 diabetes that are on insulin, sulfonylureas or SGLT2s, that's going to be something where we're probably going to want to put a pause or a hesitation to thinking about the ketogenic diet. Someone who has a history of disordered eating or an eating disorder, we can make all kinds of different food rules from following something this rigid. This is, I think, going to be very disruptive to someone's relationship with food if they were to do something this strict in nature. So that's where we would want to put a hard pause there. Also, those with a history of mood disorders, because there's going to be a lot to consider as it relates to medications that we may be taking, history of GI disturbances, alcohol abuse, malnourished or risk of malnutrition, children's and teens. Children's and teens are a population where they need a variety of foods. They need true glucose, true carbohydrate to go into those cells. We really don't want to put adolescents in a position of following a ketogenic diet unless we have to therapeutically do it for epilepsy purposes. So for the most part, we really want to, and again, that kind of goes back to prevention of eating disorders and disordered eating as well. Pregnant and breastfeeding mothers, we want to make sure that those that are pregnant or breastfeeding are getting adequate glucose, micronutrients from all the food groups, including those from carbohydrate sources, because we want to make sure that that is passing in the breast milk and also to the womb. So that's where a ketogenic diet would not be recommended. And then also I just put, I try to be funny about it, but just realistically, those that love carbohydrates and live a lifestyle where carbohydrates are routinely incorporated. So again, is this going to affect you socially? Is this going to hinder any kind of impromptu or even planned outings with friends or family as it revolves around food, and being able to maintain it? If you are eating independently, like 90 to 99% of the time, then maybe this is not an issue. But if you typically are involved with other folks when it comes to eating and all that stuff, then that's something that we want to consider. When we are thinking about like, oh, who could this be ideal for? Maybe someone who's a newly diagnosed person with type 2 diabetes, but not on insulin, or those that are just simply have that elevated BMI, that overweight or obesity category, who are interested in intentional weight loss. And then that combination where we have that elevated BMI and we have type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, and we want to see how this works for us. So again, really being able to talk to our clinician, our physician about this to see the safety and efficacy of this. And also too, when we're thinking about implementing a ketogenic diet, so many people consider this to be the bacon and butter diet, and that's not the case. We really want to think about the quality fats that we're putting in. This isn't just, oh, let me just eat a ton of butter and bacon and cheese. We want to intentionally incorporate a lot of really healthy fats, not just a ton of saturated animal fat. We're going to be looking at doing something like avocados, using a lot of heart healthy oils, the fats that we get from nuts, from salmon, things of that nature. So really, you want to make this in consultation with your physician. And I heavily encourage you to work with a registered dietitian. And it's not just because I'm a registered dietitian, but that person is going to help you get creative and out of the box with really planning out what those meals are going to look like, because some of us, we're going a little too crazy with following the influencers on social media. And so I have to cringe with some of the because they'll use the buzzwords like, oh, here's my top go-to keto lunch in a pinch. And I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, that looks like the worst thing ever in terms, I'm thinking about cardiovascular health and like all of that saturated fat where, this could really be done a lot more intentionally, where we're making sure that we're not missing the micronutrients that we would otherwise be missing. So we want to make sure that we're intentional with it. And also too, it's not necessarily advisable to cycle back and forth between keto and normal eating, especially those with insulin resistance, because each time you do that, it's going to be harder and harder to achieve ketosis. Now, you might anecdotally say, well, that's not the case for me, and that's totally fine. But I did just want to point out there that the research is suggesting that it can be difficult if you have someone who's constantly going back and forth all the time. So just to expand a little bit more on the dietitian's role in this, really when you're working with a registered dietitian and you're pursuing a ketogenic diet, I told you guys from the get-go that this is not normally a therapeutic eating style that I recommend to my patients. However, if I did have a client that I was seeing that was not coming to me for an eating disorder or disordered eating, but they wanted to explore it as a way of weight management, my professional responsibility in this is to assist them in what their preferences are to pursue this, but make sure that they're doing it as healthfully as possible, really getting to be that resource for thinking outside of the box, for menu ideas, how to make up for a lot of the lost micronutrients that may be happening as we're abstaining from a significant amount of carbohydrate. And really, also that dietitian can help you determine, do you really need to go on that quote unquote standard ketogenic diet, or could we achieve what you're allegedly trying to achieve with something that's modified? Do you really need to go into full ketosis for this to happen? Or is it just the fact that you are going to be a little bit more mindful of your carbohydrate intake, and that in turn is helping with your weight loss? So, I think that that's really going to be key for making it feel sustainable long term. So again, that is a shameless plug for a dietitian, but I promise, even if I wasn't a dietitian, I would still include that in these slides. So when we think about the concluding statements, I wanted to put this meme because it made me laugh really hard, because I've seen some folks that they get really dicey if you eat the foods that are safe or intended for whatever kind of diet they're on, and somebody else eats them. Not always with the keto diet, could be with anything, but I just had to laugh. But really, the long-term research is still lacking. They're not a cure-all for everyone. Again, this is a tool that's available in the toolbox. Whether it's a tool that's applicable to you or not is going to be for you to determine, and your health history is also going to determine that too. And I would say that there are other things that I would probably encourage clients to explore before they do this, mostly because you have to be so intentional about how you do this. And then thinking about, just the social situations related to that too. And I'm not saying that it's impossible to do. You got to be intentional with it. And sometimes, restaurant selections aren't always the best in terms of having those keto friendly options. And so you want to take those considerations. And there can be definite risk associated with a ketogenic diet. So making sure that you let your physician know that you're interested in pursuing this. And, really the ketogenic diet is still considered to be a therapeutic diet that's not meant to be followed long term. There are studies that are going on right now that are continuing to explore what that long-term life looks like for the ketogenic diet. But really, for the most part right now, when you're looking at the purported benefits and results, that's really from a short-term standpoint. So that's something that we do want to make sure that we are taking into consideration. But please, 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 I want you to feel free to contact me for anything that you need. I will be doing the Better Bites presentation on Thursday with some intuitive eating and mindful eating. And if you end up going to that and you are at this today and you want to ask me a keto question afterwards, please feel free to do so. I also want you to feel comfortable emailing me at any point in time. I've appreciated getting to have the opportunity to intentionally research this more, because again, this is not something that I therapeutically use with my normal clients, but it's good for me to continue to be abreast of the research that is out with the ketogenic diet, so that when I do have clients that want to explore it, I can really let them know what this is going to look like for them, and how to do it as safely as possible. And so with that said, I'm going to hush up for a second and take a look at the chat. If y'all have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. Miranda, actually, I don't know if we have the settings to allow the participants to do that, but if we do, please feel free to do that. And then again, you may not think of your questions until later on in the day, in the week, whenever. So that's why I want you to feel very comfortable emailing me. And I just appreciate y'all's time today.
Thank you so much, Sheena. I'm sorry I can't get my camera to work, but
No problem.
thank you for your great presentation. We appreciate you taking the time to educate us on some nutrition.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Oh, I do see a question in the chat about Thursday. Yes, you can bring your own lunch, and you can just bring whatever you would like to eat, like on a normal day. Would that be okay, Sheena?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, if you are following a ketogenic diet right now, and you want to bring a keto friendly lunch, you totally can. But really, this is just bring whatever your heart and your tummy desires on Thursday, and we'll have a lot of fun with it when we start talking about intuitive eating and mindful eating. So, thank you for asking that. And also too, I just want to make mention that I appreciate the ones that are talking about their experience with the Verta program and the dietitian slash nutritionist that's available. To help navigate that. I know that there in some ways have been some concern and controversy with that, but just knowing that they have several clinicians that provide that support is great, because it can feel overwhelming. And, as the science and the research evolves, we want to make sure that we have clinicians that are following our cases in particular. So I appreciate those that are using the program, sharing their experience with that. But again, y'all holler at me if you need anything. Otherwise, until next time, folks. Thank you, Miranda.
Yeah, thank you so much. Y'all have a great day.